Hi everyone, welcome to week 2. So, this week we're going to be gearing up to turn in our first work of fiction. And so, I wanted to go over that piece with you a little bit and maybe give you some insight and some little tips and tricks that you can work on this week. So, the thing I think that you should do to help you out is to actually click on a link in the prompt. So, if you look at the Flash Fiction assignment prompt, there's a link to something called Flash Fiction Online. This is an online literary magazine that specializes in flash fiction. I promise I won't keep doing that. And I think their guidelines, if you were to submit to their magazine, give us some insight into what your piece has to accomplish. Okay? And by the way, as a side note, if you want to submit to some of these online literary magazines or just literary magazines in general, that's something we could talk about. And if you have any interest on that, I can do a separate sort of blog post about that. Anyway, though, if you look at in terms of what they're looking for on their website, they say, we consider flash fiction a complete story in a tiny package. We want developed, empathetic characters and discernible, resolved plots. So I think that sort of beautifully describes flash fiction in a nutshell. So in the prompt, you might think, oh, well, wow, this is, very short. I don't, this is great. This is not going to be that hard. Flash fiction, in a lot of ways, I always find is so much harder than a normal short story because you basically have to do everything a short story does, but in this very compact, condensed time frame, okay? And so if you're thinking about a story that is sprawling, that takes place over several years or generations, that's probably not a good idea for flash fiction. You want something that the reader can just grab and get into, and that there's some sort of resolution, and that things are resolved in some form or another. And so, if you think about doing something that needs a lot of background, like a story that needs a lot of unpacking in terms of like you need to tell this long history of something, that might not be the best, use of flash fiction. So, when you're thinking about flash fiction, if there is this big background or history that needs to be known, I would see if there's a way to condense that information in such a way that makes it so that the reader feels and understands that information without you having to describe it. So I'm sounding very vague right now, but let me give you an example of this. So the iceberg theory by Hemingway is a good way to kind of understand how to make something condensed. So Hemingway's whole iceberg theory goes like this, that he wants you to feel the story more than you understand the story, so that he's more concerned with how you feel about the characters in the story rather than knowing what happened in the story or what the characters, what happened to them before or maybe even after the story. And so if you think about an iceberg, you really only get the tip of an iceberg, right, in terms of the visual, but you understand that there's this whole massive thing underneath it. And so for Hemingway, it's like you might understand that there's all this stuff happening underneath the surface in these characters' lives, but you really are only seeing a fraction of it. And so if you think of a great example of this is his really famous flash fiction piece, and it's basically just a sentence that says, "For sale, baby shoes, never worn." And so that, in that sentence, you feel all of this about, a couple or a mother trying to sell baby shoes, and you wonder what happened to the baby, and there's all this sort of, stuff underground that you feel about the story. And so that when you're trying to create a flash fiction piece, that's something I would try to take into consideration is like, I can't tell the history of these people or this person, so I'm going to have to imply and allude to that history in my story. Okay, and so for example, if you are having a couple and they're at dinner or something, think about the actions and the way in which they talk to one another. What does that convey to us about their history? And this goes back to something we talked about last week with characterization, right? And so you're going to have to be very keen with your characterization in order to get us to understand who this person is or who these characters are in this very short amount of time. So, what I'm basically trying to say is you want to throw us into it. And in the separate blog post, I'm going to be talking about openings and one specific type of opening. But I think that might help you sort of think about how to begin this type of story. Okay? So just to kind of wrap up, when you're thinking about this week, you have to have a really fleshed out idea of your characters and who they are, rather than like having to explain to us. And so just have the characters interact, right away, and so we could get a sense of their background and history, rather than sitting here telling us all these thoughts and information about these people. Okay, so this really goes back to this last week's post about characterization and really knowing your characters. And so when you're thinking about, before you start, really thinking about who this person is, how they would react, and that's the way you're going to be able to show the history of this person and their interactions with other people and their shared histories, rather than being able to explain it, because in this short amount of time you're not going to have the space. Another thing that you might want to do in terms of flash fiction is pick a scenario where there's a specific time frame, where there's like a clock kind of running in the background, whether that's literal or physical, right? So for example, you might have a story about someone on a bus, and that they're going to be getting off soon or something, or that people in a class, or people on their lunch break. So I think that sense of time, and that there's a discernible end to this scenario, kind of helps in flash fiction, especially if you're you, the author, because it gives you a window, and you have to work within that window in terms of finishing your story. And so if this is, like it says, you could kind of base it off anything. If this is something real, you got to think about really how to slice down the moment. And I always find that flash fiction works better when it's, like a moment, or like has a specific time, rather than trying to draw it out like maybe a normal short story or a movie, where it might take place over months, weeks, years, decades, right? And so I think with flash fiction, the sort of the thin slice is the best way to go, personally. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't good examples of it working in other ways, but in my experience, this is what I've seen to be most effective and most interesting in terms of the genre, is the sort of the thin slice, the moment, the short moment, whether it's the bus ride or the lunch, or whatever it is. So that's my advice. But like I said, rules, of course, are always meant to be broken. So if you ever want to go over this, kind of hash out these ideas, this is perfect stuff to talk about in the discussion boards this week, or ask me in the instructor area. All right, good luck with your stories this week. And I would definitely check out this online literary magazine to kind of get a sense of modern flash fiction. And it'll kind of maybe plug you in. Like I said, if you want to submit, I can give you some pointers there and other places that might take your work. All right, talk to you soon. Bye.